A judge laughs while a black man begs for mercy. Everyone freezes when the door opens and a powerful figure steps in. If you believe no black man should ever be mocked while pleading for justice, subscribe and stand tall now. The courtroom was colder than Kendrick Holloway had imagined. Not just from the chill in the air, but from the silence, the eyes that didn't see him, and the hearts that had already closed. He stood in the center of the courtroom 3B, wrists bound in steel cuffs, ankles shackled to match. Each step forward made the chains clink softly, a cruel reminder of his status. The courtroom floor, smooth, polished, and gray, reflected the dull lighting from above, casting faint shadows that stretched like judgment itself. Kendrick's breaths came shallow. His heart thudded against his chest, loud only to himself. At 32, he had never imagined standing here. Not like this. Not accused of something he hadn't done. He was a mechanic, not a thief. He fixed cars. He didn't strip them. From the bench above, Judge Horace Dillinger watched with detached interest. A man in his 60s with deep creases carved into his face, Dillinger had earned a reputation as someone who rarely smiled, unless it was at someone else's expense. His black robe sat heavy on his shoulders like a curtain hiding a sharp blade. He was known for moving fast, speaking faster, and rarely second-guessing his instincts. And his instinct today told him Kendrick was guilty. Kendrick tried to hold his head high, but his eyes gave him away. They darted, first to the jury, who looked more bored than engaged, then to the prosecutor, a short, balding man with a confident smirk, and finally to his own attorney. Mr. Carter. The sight of his court-appointed lawyer didn't inspire much hope. Mr. Carter sat slouched, flipping through a wrinkled stack of papers with no urgency. He hadn't asked Kendrick a single question during the recess. He hadn't objected to the prosecution's flimsy timeline. He hadn't even looked at Kendrick since they'd walked in. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began smoothly, "we will show today that Mr. Holloway not only had opportunity and motive, but also intimate knowledge of the dealership's security layout, making him the ideal suspect in the disappearance of over $4,000 worth of high-end auto parts." Kendrick's mouth went dry. He wanted to speak, to interrupt, to scream, but Carter put a hand on his arm, a silent command to stay quiet. The attorney didn't even raise his head to look Kendrick in the eye. As the prosecutor outlined a rough timeline of the crime, Kendrick stared at the polished table in front of him, his mind racing. That day, just 2 weeks ago, had started like any other. He'd clocked in at 7:01 a.m. and headed straight to the garage. The front desk, where the theft occurred, was out of his sight and responsibility. There had been a new guy up front, Kyle or Kevin. Kendrick barely remembered the name, but something about him had seemed off. Nervous, twitchy, but Kendrick hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, that same kid was nowhere to be found. "We also have records indicating Mr. Holloway was involved in a juvenile case years ago, involving petty theft," the prosecutor added. Kendrick's head snapped up. "That was when I was 17, he said, voice cracking. "I did community service and kept clean since then. I've worked every day for the last 11 years. Judge Dillinger's eyebrows lifted with mock interest. "Oh, now you're a model citizen," he said, leaning forward. "Or maybe just good at not getting caught." Laughter trickled from the gallery, faint but cruel. Kendrick flinched as if slapped. "I was working in the garage," Kendrick said, louder this time. "Check the cameras. There's footage. I was under a car the whole time the parts went missing." "And suddenly you're an expert in criminal investigations," Dillinger chuckled. His voice carried through the courtroom, thick with sarcasm. A few jurors smiled. Kendrick's throat tightened. He turned, searching for anyone who might care. Even the court clerk, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked away when Kendrick's eyes met his. Carter remained motionless. "There's no fingerprints," Kendrick said. "No one saw me up front. I wasn't near the scene, and the parts weren't found anywhere near me." The prosecutor didn't flinch. "And yet, you had access. You had motive. You've struggled with rent payments. You have prior history. It all fits." Kendrick's hands curled into fists. He opened his mouth to speak, but Dillinger raised a hand. "That's enough," the judge said. "You'll have your chance during sentencing." "But that's tomorrow," Kendrick replied, his voice trembling. "Please, I'm begging you. Look at the footage before you decide anything." Dillinger reclined in his chair, looking at Kendrick as if he were a noise in the background. "I've made my decision. You can beg all you want." Bang! The gavel struck like a gunshot. The courtroom went silent. Kendrick's shoulders sagged. He felt hollow, as if something vital inside him had been scooped out and thrown away. The guards moved in. One of them gave him a sympathetic glance but said nothing as they led him toward the holding area. His footsteps were heavy now. The sound of his chains echoed across the floor. He cast one last look over his shoulder toward the jurors, the judge, even the gallery. No one met his gaze. No one. Later, in the dim light of the holding cell, Kendrick sat alone on a metal bench, staring at the floor. His fingers trembled, but not from fear, from helplessness. His whole life had narrowed to a single point, a plea that no one wanted to hear. "I didn't do it," he whispered to himself, voice barely audible. "I swear, I didn't do it." Above him, a small vent hummed quietly. And somewhere beyond that courtroom, a man in a black overcoat was already on his way. But Kendrick didn't know that yet. All he had in that moment was silence, and the hope that someone, anyone, was still listening. Only those who respect dignity over power will subscribe. Real ones. This is your moment? Just before sentencing, the air in courtroom 3B felt heavier than usual, like something unseen was pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The murmur of voices rose and fell, barely above a whisper as Kendrick Holloway stood at the defense table, his hands still cuffed, head bowed low. The pale morning light streamed through the tall windows behind the judge's bench, casting long shadows across the floor. A few reporters sat in the gallery, pens in hand, waiting to document what they assumed would be a quick final blow to a case no one had truly investigated. Judge Horace Dillinger adjusted his robes and flipped open his sentencing notes, his eyes moving disinterestedly across the page. The prosecutor sat smugly, arms folded, already certain of the outcome. No one looked at Kendrick, not the jury, not the clerk, not even his own lawyer. He was alone in a room full of people. Then the doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open, not with a loud crash but with a controlled, deliberate force, the kind that made people turn before they even knew why. The rustle of papers stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Into that silence stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man. His posture was upright, military sharp. His dark overcoat swayed slightly with each step, but what drew every eye was the glimpse of a green uniform underneath and a silver badge clipped neatly to his belt. He didn't shout. He didn't hurry. He simply walked forward, each step echoing clearly on the polished floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. "I need the court's attention," the man said, his voice even and calm, but beneath it was a command that demanded respect. The kind of voice that didn't ask for permission. It took Judge Dillinger a moment to respond, startled not by the volume but by the certainty in the man's tone. "Who are you, and why are you interrupting proceedings?" the judge asked, trying to sound authoritative, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his discomfort. The man didn't flinch. He stopped just past the first row of benches, pulled a leather folder from his coat, and held it up as he spoke. "Major Leon Holloway, United States Intelligence, retired. I'm Kendrick's brother, and I have the evidence your court chose to ignore." The courtroom, frozen in confusion just moments before, now sat in absolute stillness. The bailiff hesitated, glancing toward Judge Dillinger, but the judge didn't move. Leon stepped forward on his own, placing the sealed envelope directly into the bailiff's hand. "This contains a full data log from the security system at West Elm Auto. It includes time-stamped footage showing my brother in the service bay, under a vehicle, while the theft occurred at the front counter. The system logs confirm his keycard was used to clock in at 7:48 a.m., and he remained in the garage for the next 3 hours without stepping into the customer area once. "This isn't how court procedures work," Dillinger protested, his voice rising with irritation. Leon turned his head slowly toward the bench. "Neither is laughing at a man begging for his life while you knowingly suppress evidence that proves his innocence," he replied coldly. "This court was subpoenaed. You chose to ignore it." There was a shuffling sound as members of the jury straightened in their seats. The tension was no longer between a defendant and the system. It was between the truth and the wall that had been built to keep it out. Kendrick looked up for the first time in minutes, his eyes wide, his lips parted. He seemed frozen between disbelief and hope, afraid to trust what he was seeing. Leon looked to the jury. "My brother has no voice here. You all saw that yesterday. But if justice still means something in this courtroom, you'll look at what I brought, and you'll see the truth for yourselves." The prosecutor began to rise from his seat, mouth open to object, but Dillinger lifted a hand, tight, angry, but silent. "Let the footage be played," the judge said through gritted teeth. The bailiff took the USB from the folder, inserted it into the courtroom monitor, and brought the screen to life. The video began with a digital timestamp in the upper corner. The interior of the auto shop appeared. Bright, sterile, familiar. A car was suspended on the hydraulic lift. Beneath it was Kendrick, his uniform covered in grease, his hands busy replacing a brake system. In the background, another man entered through the side door, glancing around nervously. He passed through the customer area, opened the supply cabinet, and began stuffing boxes into a duffel bag. The man was clearly identifiable, a technician named Sean Ryder, whose name had been mentioned during the initial investigation but never followed up on. Ryder looked directly at the camera twice. The room collectively gasped. Kendrick's head dropped again, not in shame, but in disbelief. It had been so long since anyone believed him that seeing the truth felt like waking from a nightmare. The jury exchanged glances. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. Even the prosecutor's jaw tensed. Judge Dillinger sat still, his face drained of color. The monitor paused on a frame showing Kendrick bent over the vehicle, a wrench in his hand, Ryder disappearing into the back exit. Leon let the silence stretch. Then, calmly, he turned back to the judge. "Dismiss the charges," he said. Dillinger leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking much smaller than before. "Case." "Dismissed," he said, barely above a whisper. But Leon wasn't done. He walked to the center of the room, each step measured. He faced the judge directly. This wasn't a mistake. It was neglect. It was arrogance, and it nearly cost an innocent man his freedom. He pulled another document from his folder and held it up. "This is a formal complaint filed with the Judicial Oversight Board. Your court's failure to act on a lawful subpoena, your conduct during trial, and your suppression of exonerating evidence will all be reviewed. You may not care about justice, but I do." Judge Dillinger didn't respond. He simply stared at the desk before him, fingers trembling near the gavel he never lifted again that morning. Leon turned to Kendrick, walked over, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Kendrick's breathing was uneven, his legs unsteady. "You okay?" Leon asked quietly. Kendrick nodded slowly. "I think so," he whispered. I didn't think anyone would come." Leon smiled faintly. "Told you, little brother. I don't let snakes get the last word." The courtroom remained silent, not from shock anymore, but from shame. What they had all witnessed was more than a legal correction. It was a reminder. Justice hadn't crept in through procedure or paperwork. It had kicked the door down and stood its ground. He begged for mercy. They gave him silence. If that moment shook you, hit subscribe and never stay quiet. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. created to highlight the impact of racial bias and the importance of justice and fairness in legal systems. Its purpose is to inspire conversations about empathy, accountability, and the need for equality in all aspects of life.